In the summer of 1940, in a tiny Japanese consulate in Lithuania, one man faced an impossible choice: obey the clear, repeated orders of his government, or condemn thousands of desperate people to certain death. This man was Chiune Sugihara, a career diplomat trained in the absolute loyalty of the Japanese Foreign Service. As Jewish refugees, running from the advancing Nazi war machine, massed outside his office, Sugihara sat at his desk, his hand cramping, writing the most revolutionary document of his life, a simple transit visa. What followed was a 30-day frenzy of defiance that saved an estimated 6,000 lives, creating a lifeline just before the Soviet and German forces closed the trap. But the story doesn't end with that heroic act. Sugihara returned home, was stripped of his career, and spent the rest of his life in obscurity, never knowing if his risk had made a difference. This is the story of a forgotten hero, a diplomat who traded his future for the lives of strangers. We will trace his journey from rural Japan to the diplomatic hot zone of Kaunas, explore the profound moral clarity that drove his decision, and finally, reveal the decades-long secret that ultimately proved his immense sacrifice was worth the price. To understand why a loyal Japanese diplomat risked everything for thousands of Jewish refugees, you first have to understand that Chiune Sugihara's entire career was built on quiet insubordination. He was not a man built for blind obedience. His path started not with duty, but defiance. His father wanted him to be a doctor, but Sugihara deliberately failed the medical entrance exam to pursue literature and language instead. This stubborn independence was his defining characteristic. It led him to win a prestigious diplomatic scholarship, but instead of the usual European assignment, he was sent to Harbin, China, to become the Japanese government's foremost expert on the Russian language and the Soviet political machine. Sugihara excelled, demonstrating fierce loyalty to Japan by successfully negotiating the sale of the Northern Manchurian Railway at a favorable price. He became a high-value asset to his government, but his moral compass was already spinning off axis. In 1934, while serving as a senior diplomat in Manchukuo, Sugihara became disgusted by the Japanese military's cruel treatment of the local Chinese population. In an extraordinary act of principle, risking his entire future career, he resigned his post in protest. This was an unprecedented display of placing conscience above command. The foreign ministry shuffled him to Europe, hoping the difficult bureaucrat would conform. But by the time Sugihara arrived in Lithuania, he was already a man who had proved he valued moral conviction over professional security. The stage was set for a crisis that would demand everything he had. In November 1939, Chiune Sugihara arrived in Kaunas, Lithuania, to serve as the vice-consul for the Japanese Empire. His official mission was simple: to set up a small consulate and monitor the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. Situated near the Soviet border, Kaunas was a key observation post. Sugihara's primary duty was to collect intelligence on the movements of both Soviet and German troops, anticipating the inevitable conflict between the two massive powers. The war that had erupted in the West quickly transformed Kaunas from a tranquil capital into a desperate, temporary safe haven. Following the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, tens of thousands of Polish Jewish refugees fled eastward, finding a fleeting reprieve in neutral Lithuania. By late 1939, the Jewish refugee population in Lithuania, concentrated in cities like Kaunas and Vilna, swelled the local Jewish communities. This was a diverse group, including students and rabbis from celebrated religious academies like the Mir Yeshiva, Zionist youth groups seeking passage to Palestine, and educated professionals, all cut off from their homes and families. They had escaped the initial Nazi atrocities, but were dependent on external charity and constantly searching for a final escape route. The political situation, however, deteriorated rapidly. In June 1940, the Soviet Union occupied Lithuania, and by August, it was formally annexed as a Soviet republic. The refugees, already stateless and vulnerable, were now faced with a brutal choice: accept Soviet citizenship or leave immediately. The Soviets ordered all foreign diplomatic missions, including the Japanese consulate, to close by late August. The window of escape was slamming shut. The refugees now knew that the fate awaiting them in occupied Europe was genocide, a terror far greater than Soviet exile. Their only hope lay in transit visas that would allow them passage through the Soviet Union via the Trans-Siberian Railway, and then onward travel through Japan to a final destination. The most critical element was the Japanese transit visa. The Japanese government, however, had strict criteria. A transit visa would only be issued to those who possessed a guaranteed final destination visa to an onward country and sufficient funds for the journey. Crucially, many of the refugees only possessed bogus destination visas for the Dutch Caribbean island of Curaçao, ingeniously provided by Jans Wartendijk, the Dutch honorary consul in Kaunas. These visas were valid only in theory, as Curaçao required no entry visa, and were never intended for real use, but they provided the necessary paper trail to apply for the Japanese transit visa. Still, the refugees lacked the necessary money and the official sanction from Tokyo. In late July 1940, Sugihara looked out of his consulate window and saw a crowd of hundreds of Polish Jewish refugees gathered outside. Day after day, they stood there, desperate, pleading, pushing petitions and letters through the gate, begging for the transit documents that meant life. Sugihara was acutely aware of the danger facing them. He also knew the risk to his position. He sent an urgent cable to his superiors in Tokyo, asking for permission to issue the visas en masse, explaining that the refugees were in imminent danger. The response was immediate and unequivocal. The foreign ministry, headed by the pragmatic minister Yosuke Matsuoka, who was focused on maintaining the alliance with Nazi Germany and avoiding trouble with the Soviet Union, refused. Sugihara cabled 2 more times, each time reiterating the humanitarian emergency, and each time receiving the same stern, official response. The final cable stated simply, concerning transit visas, stop. It is advisable not to issue visas to any applicant unless he or she has a final exit visa. No exceptions can be made. Stop. No further inquiries are expected. Stop. For a Japanese diplomat, defying an order repeated 3 times was unthinkable, an act of idiocracy. The decision Sugihara faced was existential, both for himself and the thousands of people outside his gate. Sugihara consulted with his wife Yukiko. She recalled their conversation, confirming their mutual support for the act of defiance. The core of his decision was simple: to follow the law and condemn thousands of innocent people to death, or to follow his conscience and save them, at the cost of his career and perhaps his family's safety. He chose the latter. As he is often quoted, he stated, "I may have disobeyed my government, but if I hadn't, I would have been disobeying God." Starting around July 18, 1940, and continuing relentlessly until the consulate was forcibly closed, Sugihara plunged into a frenzy of writing. He worked 12 to 18 hours a day, filling out visa forms by hand. To be legitimate, each visa had to be personally signed, stamped with the consulate seal, and properly numbered. To save time, he ignored the prerequisite rules, issuing the 10-day transit visas to anyone who needed one, regardless of whether they had the necessary money or the correct final destination papers. He issued the visas not just for individuals, but for families, multiplying the total number of lives saved with every document. In total, over the span of roughly 30 days, Sugihara issued more than 2,100 visas, which were used to save an estimated 6,000 lives. He worked at such a frantic pace that his hand often cramped, and he was said to have gone through entire consulate ink supplies. When the Soviet government forced the consulate to close on August 28, 1940, Sugihara continued his work from a hotel. When the final date came for his departure, he was at the Kaunas train station. Even as his train was pulling away, with refugees running alongside the tracks, Sugihara continued to write. He grabbed the consulate seal and began signing blank pieces of paper, tossing them out the open window. When he could write no more, he is reported to have bowed deeply and said, "Please forgive me. I can't write any more. I wish you the best." He handed the official consulate seal to a refugee, imploring them to continue stamping the documents. This final, desperate act was the last chance for hundreds of lives. The refugees who obtained the Sugihara visas embarked on the epic yet perilous journey across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union via the Trans-Siberian Railway to the Japanese port of Suruga. From there, many settled temporarily in Shanghai, China, which was then under Japanese control, before dispersing to safer havens around the globe, including the United States, Australia, and Israel. The visas were a temporary passage, but in the context of the Holocaust, a temporary passage was all that was needed for survival. Following his heroic period in Kaunas, Sugihara was reassigned to various posts in Nazi-occupied Europe, serving in Prague, East Prussia, and finally as the Consul General in Bucharest, Romania. At the war's end in 1945, when the Soviets took control of Romania, Sugihara and his family were detained in a Soviet internment camp for over a year. They were released in 1946, but detained once more in Vladivostok on their long, arduous journey back to Japan. The consequences of his defiance became concrete in 1947. Upon his return to Japan, Sugihara was asked to resign from the foreign ministry. The official reason cited was the downsizing of the diplomatic corps during the post-war American occupation. However, Sugihara and his family believed, with good reason, that his unauthorized actions in Kaunas were the true cause for his forced retirement. Chiune Sugihara spent the next several decades of his life in relative obscurity, stripped of his diplomatic status and pension. He took on a series of low-paying odd jobs, including working as a translator, an interpreter, and eventually as a manager for a Japanese trade company in Moscow, where he lived and worked for long periods between 1960 and 1975. He was, by all accounts, a forgotten man in his home country. During these years of obscurity, Sugihara never spoke of his wartime actions and never truly knew if the immense risk he had taken had actually saved anyone. In a society that valued conformity, his act of disobedience was a heavy burden, a past he kept silent. The silence was finally broken in 1968, 28 years after he left Kaunas, when a survivor, Nesri Yeshua, who had become an Israeli diplomat, successfully tracked Sugihara down in Japan. This reunion was the first confirmation that Sugihara's visas for life had worked. As more survivors began to share their stories, the scope of his heroism was revealed to the world. The ultimate, formal recognition came in 1984, when Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority, bestowed upon Chiune Sugihara the title of Righteous Among the Nations, the highest honor, granted to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Though he was too ill to attend, his wife and son accepted the award in a ceremony in Jerusalem in 1985, a year before his death on July 31, 1986. Sugihara's hometown of Yaotsu, Japan, and the city of Kaunas, Lithuania, where the miracle took place, have since erected monuments and memorials in his honor, ensuring that the legacy of this quiet, determined diplomat is finally cemented in history. Chiune Sugihara's story is not merely a historical footnote of World War II rescue, it is a profound ethical lesson that transcends borders and generations. His decision to defy the stringent orders of his government encapsulates the central struggle between bureaucratic mandates and moral imperative. He understood that sometimes true loyalty, not to a state or a flag, but to the fundamental principle of human dignity, requires an act of profound civil disobedience. In an era defined by mass brutality and calculated indifference, Sugihara's unwavering commitment to the people outside his window offered a beacon of hope. The papers he signed were not merely transit permits, they were instruments of salvation, forged by a man who chose empathy over expediency. He was willing to sacrifice his entire professional life, enduring years of post-war anonymity and hardship, because he could not bear to send vulnerable people to their doom. The estimated 40,000 to 100,000 descendants living today, the Sugihara survivors, are the living legacy of a single man's signature. Their very existence poses a timeless question to all viewers. What is the limit of your obedience when facing injustice? Chiune Sugihara's answer, written in thousands of hurried strokes of ink, was clear. Humanity must always come first. His quiet heroism, though unrecognized for decades, has finally taken its rightful place in the pantheon of moral giants, a reminder that the actions of one individual can truly save an entire universe.